Welcome to the Money Rules Podcast, where we tackle your personal financial matters with leading financial advisors. Your host, Boitumelo Ntsoko.
Trust can be powerful tools for managing your assets and protecting your wealth for future generations. However, establishing a trust can be complex and requires careful consideration. We're joined by Eric Jordan, a certified financial planner at Crew Invest, to guide us through this subject. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Tumi.
To start, can you please explain why someone might consider establishing a trust?
Certainly. So establishing a trust, it is very important at the outset to be clear about what your objectives are with those trusts. Because a trust can play many different roles within an estate plan. Some of the reasons why you would want to set up a trust, as an example, is to try and protect assets potentially from beneficiaries who are not capable of managing those assets themselves. It can also be for reasons of protecting your personal assets from potentially business assets and creditors. It could also be to make sure that assets are protected for future generations. So that, as you can hear, there's many different types of reasons other than the well-known reasons for managing estate costs in the event of a death.
Can you please walk us through the different types of trusts that are available?
Sure. So once you understand what your objective for the trust is, it then makes choosing the type of trust that's appropriate for you a lot easier. So as an example, you could have a testamentary trust, which is a trust that's set up in your will, and that will specifically or typically be used for beneficiaries who receive inheritance from you but are not in a position to manage those assets by themselves. From an estate planning point of view, there's also other reasons, and then you would be looking at what people call an inter vivos or living trust. And typically there you would be either looking between either a vesting trust, in which instance a beneficiary of that trust gets a direct vested interest in either the capital and the income of the trust, or a discretionary trust, in which instance trustees of the trust can determine which of the beneficiaries benefit from the trust and in which proportions.
And let's go through the step-by-step process of setting up a trust. What would be the first step individuals need to take?
So a trust really starts off by setting up the trust deed, because that's the document that actually provides the life to a trust. So it's important to, first of all, determine what the purpose of the trust is, and then the next step would be to determine what the trust deed needs to look like, because all the rights and obligations of a trust must be clearly set out within that trust deed. So once the trust deed has been set up, you can then take the next steps of actually determining who the trustees of the trust needs to be, who the beneficiaries of them needs to be, and then you can go into the formal process of actually registering the trust with the Master of the High Court.
How does one choose the appropriate type of trust?
Yes, so the appropriate type of trust has a lot to do with what your original objective of the trust needs to be. So looking at that in terms of who the beneficiaries needs to be and what your ultimate purpose of the trust is, you then need to select either whether these beneficiaries must have a vested right to the assets of the trust, in which instance you would look at setting up a vested or bewind trust, it's also known as, or where you want to have more of an estate planning purpose to the trust and determining how to allocate income or capital to different beneficiaries. You would then rather go and use a discretionary trust for that specific purpose.
What factors should an individual consider when determining which assets to transfer into the trust and how to facilitate that transfer?
Yes, so clearly identifying which assets need to be transferred is an important role, and that needs to determine what the purpose of the trust is going to be. Typically, in an estate planning environment, you would want to look at what your growth assets would be. Those assets that you foresee would grow in value into the future, and therefore you would want to transfer those assets out of your personal estate into the trust in order to save on estate costs, etc. So once you've identified what the type of assets are that you want to transfer into the trust, the next step would be what are the mechanisms of transferring those assets into it. So those can either be by donating the assets to the trust, in which instance you need to consider the donation's tax implications or alternatively whether a sale of the asset needs to happen to the trust and what then the terms of the sale would be. Typically, a sale of an asset to a trust would go along with setting up a loan account, which the trust then owes the purchase price still to the individual who sold the asset to the trust.
And what should individuals keep in mind when selecting trustees?
Yes, so selecting trustees is a very important aspect because those are the individuals ultimately who would have the decision-making process or powers within the trust, and they are vested with what they call fiduciary duties. So they need to look after those trust assets as if it is their own assets and make the best possible decisions with those. Also, what you need to think about is the practical implications, so i.e. where these trustees are living, how easily they would be able to communicate with each other, and then further also practical decisions like having more than 2 or 3 trustees in order for decision making to be made easier. And then also where there are typically these days, the master would require what they'll call an independent trustee to also be appointed to the trust. So looking at who that person could be, as well as what the cost implications of appointing such a trustee would be.
Eric, just staying on trustees, are there fees that are attached to having trustees for the trust?
Yes, there are definitely, especially where there's independent trustees that you do appoint. There are certain guidelines in terms of how those fees can be charged. So that's a definite consideration to take into account when appointing trustees, especially with the amount of responsibility that is laid on the trustee. Is very reasonable for that trustee to insist on charging a fee, because discharging the duties as a trustee has become a considerate amount of effort that we need to go into discharging those duties.
Moving on to beneficiaries, how does the type of trust impact their rights?
Yes, so from a beneficiary's point of view, you could either be, whether you're a beneficiary of a discretionary trust, in which instance you only have a what they would call a hope or space of receiving a benefit from the trust. So in that instance, the trustees would make a decision whether or not you would receive a benefit, i.e. either income from the trust or part of a capital distribution from the trust. So the beneficiary in that instance has no vested right to receive a benefit. Should you have a vested trust, in that instance, the trust document would determine, as an example, that all income from the trust assets must be distributed to the beneficiaries, and the trust deed in that instance can also determine in what proportion the beneficiaries need to share in the distribution of that income or capital from the trust.
What factors should individuals consider when naming beneficiaries?
Yes, when naming beneficiaries, you always need to determine when you're drafting the trust deed that those beneficiaries need to be very clearly identified and determine who those beneficiaries needs to be, whether it is a specific individual or class of individuals. It's very important for the trust deed to be very clear in terms of how to identify the beneficiaries and what the purpose of the trust is and how benefits should be distributed to those beneficiaries.
Earlier on, you touched on drafting a trust deed. Could you please tell us what that involves?
Yes, so a trust deed is really what creates the structure of a trust. So that is the contract in which the founder of the trust enters into with the trustees, and that contract says that the trustees need to manage whatever assets there are in the trust for the benefit of specific beneficiaries. So nothing can happen with the trust or with trust assets that is not either authorized by the trust deed or specifically empowers the trustees to do. The trust deed then also sets out what the processes would be for managing the trust. In other words, how the trustees should conduct their meetings, how many meetings there should be, how voting can be done within trustee meetings, if there are any veto rights for a specific trustee, and how any deadlocks in a trust should be dealt with.
Eric, why must an experienced fiduciary expert handle this task of drafting a trust deed?
As you could imagine, setting up a trust is quite a complex matter to undertake. And an experienced person in drafting of trust deeds is a lot better to ensure that what your ultimate purpose of the trust is given effect to within that trust deed. Because if it's not contained within the trust deed, that aspect could not be given effect to. So it's quite important that you use someone who's highly experienced in drafting of trust deeds, and also makes provision within those trust deeds for things like potentially, if in the future you would like to amend the trust deed, that there are structures and mechanisms made provision for in the trust deed by which that can be done.
Eric, could you also just walk us through the requirements for registering a trust and what the process is?
Sure. So a trust needs to be registered in the master's office, and that is typically in the master's office in the jurisdiction in which the greatest proportion of the trust assets are kept. So the process of doing that is that you would need to approach the master of the High Court. They would therefore have to complete specific trust registration forms. You would need to provide the signed trust deeds that's been done by the founder and set up. With that, you also need to then submit a form in terms of which the initial trustees accept their duties as trustees and are willing to discharge those duties. And there's also then indicating in terms of who the beneficiaries of the trust needs to be, and that then all gets filed with the master's office. Once you've filed that application form, the master's office then reviews it, and then if they're satisfied, will then grant a trust registration number, which is then issued along with letters of authority, which is a document that provides the authority to the trustees to act as such for the trust.
Eric, there's been much talk about additional reporting requirements for trusts and trustees. Could you tell us more about that and how this may impact someone looking to establish a trust?
Yes. So in this year, in April of this year, new legislation came out, especially on the back of the grey listing that was placed on South Africa towards the end of last year. And what these amendments legislation tries to do is to give better control over funds that flow through trust, because trust traditionally has been seen as one of the vehicles through which money laundering typically could be done. So the legislation now places a lot higher obligations on trustees in terms of how they need to provide and report transactions, either to SARS or to the Financial Intelligence Center. So trustees have been placed with a lot higher obligation now, specifically on the reporting side on any transactions that happen within a trust. Further to that, they also now need to determine who the ultimate beneficial owners of the assets of the trust are, and those need to be reported as well. And that could be quite onerous task to undertake, especially where there's a class of beneficiaries, and ultimately you would need to determine who the ultimate beneficial owner of the actual assets of the trust is.
Are there any tax implications for having a trust?
Yes, from a tax implications perspective, a trust is taxed as a separate individual entity, and there's a flat tax rate of 45% on any income that is generated via a trust. And then also from a capital gains tax perspective, there's an 80% inclusion rate on any capital gain within a trust within its taxable income. So from a tax perspective, could be quite onerous to leave any income or capital gain within a trust, and therefore a lot of times beneficiaries, those income or capital gains will be vested within the beneficiaries to try and alleviate the tax burden of the trust, because any income or capital that's vested within the beneficiary within a specific tax year, that tax responsibility could then be divested down to the beneficiaries at a lot lower tax rate as opposed to the more onerous tax rate of a trust.
Are there any final insights or recommendations you'd like to share with our listeners regarding establishing a trust?
Yes, I think should you consider establishing a trust, you need to be very clear about what exactly those objectives are and how you would want to go about managing the trust. Especially with the latest legislation that's come on board, it's become more and more onerous to administer a trust. And if you're not willing to put in the effort to administer the trust in a proper way, it's best to avoid going the trust route. So just understand that should you do decide to go the trust route, you need to put in the effort to run the trust and to ensure that all the administrative requirements of running the trust is well looked after.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode and sharing these valuable insights, Eric.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity again. Much appreciated.
That was Eric Jordan, who is a certified financial planner at Crew Invest.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Money Rules Podcast. To listen to more, go to moneyweb.co.za or the Moneyweb app and follow Moneyweb News for daily updates. Money Rules. Moneyweb, your trusted source for business and investment insights.